Tanny grew up with several gorillas, and her connection to one of them was really extraordinary. But when she left, she assumed that he would completely forget her. She was advised not to see him again after many years, but to just wait and see how he would react. When Tanny, Aspen and her father Damien decided to see the animals again, which once were so dear to their hearts, they sailed with a boat to the place where the gorillas lived. Even as they saw the animals in the distance, a short distance from the shore, they could hardly wait to greet them. But they were warned not to get too close to the gorillas. These animals have been living in the wilderness for years and may not appreciate their presence. Tanny, however, had a different opinion. In her heart, she hoped that the gorillas still had the same beautiful memories of them as they had of them. For Tanny, they belonged to the family, but these gorillas had founded their own families in the wilderness, who had never lived in captivity. Getting too close was risky, everyone said, but Tanny didn't listen. As they drove down the river, they suddenly saw gorilla heads appear between the bushes. The animals watched them closely. Tanny recognized the gorilla she had once raised. Immediately, even if he had changed a lot. The boat was on, and despite the warnings of her father and the leader, Tanny jumped out. The gorilla came closer. It was Yalta, the little baby that she once held in her arms. Now he overcame her and stood on his hind legs while he came straight to Tanny. No one could stop the gorilla. No one could step between them now if something were to happen. Tanny was alone. Yalta approached and suddenly grabbed Tanny's arm. Her father wanted to storm forward, but knew that he would only worsen the situation if he scared the gorilla. Tanny had spent her life loving gorillas. She couldn't believe that her best friend from her childhood days would do her a favor. But it actually looked like he wanted to hurt her. Her friendship had begun once because Tanny's father Dammy had the mission to save animals. He founded the Aspen Foundation, which specialized in rehabilitating gorillas and bringing them back to the wilderness. For animals that could not be reinvited. There was the Howlett Zoo in Canterbury. Tanny and her siblings experienced a magical childhood there. They were constantly in the zoo and built close ties to the animals. Tanny was just 1 year old when the first gorilla came to them. He was injured and his family was killed by wild animals. Damien and his team took care of him. Tanny and her siblings also spent a lot of time in the gorilla enclosure. The gorilla became a game companion for Tanny. It was a special childhood. A special day was when Damien and Tanny picked them up from school and told them that a big surprise was waiting for them. The surprise was actually big, in the form of a little gorilla baby. Yalta was a wise child who could not survive in the wilderness alone. His mother was killed and he was still so tiny that he needed intensive care. Damien and Tanny took care of him and made sure that he was not alone. He could not be simply buried in an enclosure. Tanny and Yalta developed a deep bond that they had never forgotten and hoped that Yalta would also have it. Tanny helped in the upbringing of Yalta, but her unusual little brother grew much faster than a human sibling would have done. It didn't take long for him to grow up to live in the house. After all, a gorilla is not a pet. It was time for Yalta to move into the zoo. Nevertheless, they did not want him to be alone, and Yalta did not want that either. Fortunately, another gorilla, Bims, was waiting for them to welcome him. However, when Yalta entered the enclosure, they had to be careful. Bims was much bigger than Yalta and could have hurt him if he did not want to befriend him. Therefore, they only allowed the two gorillas to see each other through a fence. It was a crucial moment. When the two of them touched for the first time, their reactions showed a surprising tenderness. Bims even tried to play with Yalta, and the experts were soon convinced that it was safe to bring the two together. Couldn't have gone any better. They immediately became friends. Both of them worshipped Tanny and soon let them play with them again. There was no jealousy between them, and the two gorillas were incredibly attached to the girl. But the public saw it differently. Tanny was used to entering the gorillas' enclosure at any time and spending time with them. She didn't change her habit when a photo team visited the zoo to capture her special bond to the gorillas. But instead of inspiring the audience, it led to great outrage. People were angry that Tanny or other children without safety precautions. With the gorillas, the negative reaction was so strong that the zoo received a warning. If they didn't take stricter security measures, the closure was threatened. Suddenly, Tenny, Yalter, and Bims were not allowed to touch them. They could only see them through the glass of their enclosure. Although Tenny was old enough to understand that the order did not come from her father, she was too young to understand the concerns of people for their safety. The gorillas didn't understand that at first. They still wanted to play with their girlfriend and were sad when they couldn't do it anymore. The daily encounters were heartbreaking for both sides. After school, Tanny often sat on the steps next to the glass. As soon as the gorillas saw her, they hurried to her. Yalta often stood on the glass and whispered. Tanny laid her hand against the glass and Jalta did the same on his side. It was clear that he wanted to touch them. But the separation was not only a question of security. It was also necessary to prepare the gorillas for a life in the wilderness. They were now old enough to return to Africa. To ensure that they got used to life without people, they began to gradually reduce all interactions. A few months later, Yalta and Bims finished the training they needed to survive in the wilderness. Damien and his team had worked on it from the beginning. And now it was time. The two gorillas were brought to a shelter in Gabon, where they could be safe and free at the same time. On the day of the farewell, Tenny, Yalta, and Bims were allowed to hug again. The gorillas laid their heads on them and enjoyed the closeness as long as they were allowed. It was a moving scene, shaped by the deep bond between the girl and the animals. But in the end, the gorillas were packed in boxes and loaded onto trucks. The first step of their journey back to Africa. For Tanny, the farewell was bitterly sweet. She knew that this was the right way for Jalta and Bims, but it felt like she was saying goodbye to family members she might never see again. Years passed and Damien traveled to Africa to see them. The good news was that they were doing great. Yalta and Bims had integrated into a family group and lived like wild gorillas should do. When Damien saw them in the midst of their new family, he knew that all the effort had paid off. For Tanny, however, it was hard to believe that her old game comrades had completely forgotten what they used to do with each other. It was over a decade ago since they returned to Africa, and according to reports, the two gorillas had adapted to life in the wilderness. They avoided people and showed no signs that they remembered their past. Tanny was advised to never try to meet them. In the meantime, she grew up and worked for her father's foundation. Like Damien, she committed herself to the rescue and rehabilitation of animals. But then Damien's health deteriorated and everything changed. When he began planning a trip to Africa to visit his favorite place for the last time, there was a question in the room. Would you try to see the gorillas again? The journey to Yalta and Bims and their new family was long. It was not a journey that an older person could easily have undertaken. If Damien wanted to see the gorillas for the last time, he had to hurry. That was the plan. But when Tanny heard that her father was going to travel, she wanted to accompany him. She had to see how the two gorillas had developed. She had helped with the upbringing of Yalta, and it was a great deal for her to find out how he was doing. Tanny was excited, but surprisingly she warned everyone in her environment to go with her. It was almost 20 years ago since she last saw the gorillas. They were now much bigger and completely different. They told her that she would be disappointed if she saw them again. It was said that the encounter could ruin the precious memories she had of the two. But Tanny ignored the warnings. She didn't want her father to travel alone, and insisted on experiencing the gorillas firsthand. Damien was the only one who understood her. He agreed and said that she would find peace if she could see the gorillas in her natural habitat. As the encounter took place, soon after, father and daughter made their way. The first part of the journey was to fly to Gabon, but near the forest where the gorillas lived, there were neither streets nor airports. To get there, they had to drive an off-road car until they reached the base of their homeland, where they would stay for a few days, so they could make several attempts to find the gorillas if they were not successful. From the base, they took a small boat and drove along the river to get to the forest. On the morning of their first search, the leaders of the protected area explained the rules to them. They were not allowed to approach the gorillas easily. The leaders would observe the situation, and only when they were sure that the animals remained calm could Tanny and Damien approach them. Under no circumstances were they allowed to touch the gorillas or interact directly with them. The animals were now wild, and it was unclear how they would react to humans. Yalta and Bims, who used to be so gentle, could no longer be seen as tame. When the boat ran along the river, something happened that surprised Tanny and Damien. They saw faces that were spitting through the leafy roof of the trees. The gorillas watched them. It seemed as if the animals were just as curious about the visitors as vice versa. Tanny could not suppress a frightened sound. When she looked into the shadows, the familiar faces of Yalta and Bims. They had changed a lot, but she recognized them immediately. Tears ran over her cheeks when she saw her old friends from afar. Then, completely unexpected, Yalta came closer. He stretched out his strong arms and held in as if he was looking for something. Tanny felt like her knees were shaking and threatened to give up. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment she was sure that he recognized her. Without hesitating, Yalta put her head on hers, just like she did when she said goodbye. Tanny carefully stroked her head, as she had done before, when she was afraid as a baby. Yalta gently touched her arms and held her head against hers. It was as if the gorilla was greeting her. Shortly after, Bims approached her. He looked at her for a long time, before he gently stroked her face with a finger. Damien, who watched the scene, could hardly believe what he saw. The gorillas came closer, jumped up, and even played with him. It was obvious that they remembered the people who once were their family. They were careful, but the bond was indisputable. The rest of the gorilla family also approached slowly, but stayed on the edge. They seemed to feel that Yalta and Bims shared a special moment with the people, and it was a sight they would never forget. The guides were incredible. They had never thought that the gorillas, who had now been fully integrated into the wilderness, would show such a strong bond with people. It was obvious that they missed Tanny and Damien. Especially Yalta seemed to have a deep affection for Tanny. The way he looked at them and behaved showed real love. When it was finally time to return to the boats, the gorillas were silent. It was as if they understood that they would lose their old friends again. Tanny had a hard time saying goodbye, but she knew that she would carry this moment in her heart forever. The next day they were allowed to go to the gorillas again. The guides allowed them to spend another day with the animals before they had to say goodbye for good. This second goodbye was just as emotional as the first one, and when they finally left, their hearts were heavy, but also filled with happiness. To have experienced this special connection once again. Tanny knew that this might be forever. There was no guarantee that she would return one day. The gorillas seemed to feel their pain and hesitated to let them go. Bims hugged her again and held her tight. He was no longer as gentle as he used to be, but his affection was indisputable. He just didn't want to let go of her. Tanny cried as she gently pushed away his strong arms. Then she turned to Yalta, her first baby. She loved these gorillas like a family, but Yalta would always have a special place in her heart. Yalta put her head on her chest and she kissed him gently on the head. She told him quietly that she loved him. The moment was bitterly sweet, and Tanny knew that this could be a final farewell. With heavy steps, she climbed into the little boat. The gorillas stayed back and looked after them, while the boat slowly drifted down the river. Her big eyes pressed a mixture of confusion and sorrow. Tanny knew that she would never regret this journey. She was forever grateful that she had not heard the voices that she wanted to keep from this journey. It was an experience that she would exchange for nothing in the world. The gorillas were part of her family, and now she knew that they still had a special connection to her. This connection that they once shared was strong, despite the long years of separation. They now belonged where they should be, in the wilderness, to their own. And Tanny would also return where they were needed, home, to continue to save animals and to take care of their protection. Did you like this story? Can you imagine meeting a wild animal again that you knew from your childhood? Do you think that animals remember their first family? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. This story is a touching example of how deep connections between human and animal can be. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video. We wish you a wonderful day.